Welcome to the debate. Today, we're digging into a really foundational piece of strategic thinking for Pakistan, the framework laid out in Friends Near Home. It essentially proposes, well, quite a radical shift, moving away from relying on external powers, especially the U.S., which is, let's say, a mixed record, and instead building security through new regional alliances. And the core question we're tackling today, drawn from this material, is this. Is the central strategy recommended what the book calls low-profile economic integration, aiming ultimately for an enlarged economic cooperation organization, or ECO? Is that a genuinely viable, practical path for Pakistan's security? Or do the persistent geopolitical realities, and maybe internal factors too, fundamentally block its implementation?
A critical question indeed.
Towards a maritime orientation isn't just viable, it's strategically necessary in the long run. It's perhaps the only sustainable path forward.
And I'll be arguing the counterpoint. While the vision itself has undeniable strategic appeal, I believe the inherent regional conflicts, Pakistan's own deep-seated political instability, and crucially, the enduring, active influence of extra-regional forces make this kind of massive pivot, well, practically unachievable, certainly in the near to medium term.
Right. Well, the need for this pivot, as I see it and as the source lays out, it's really born from some hard lessons. The material underscores the historical unreliability of the United States as Pakistan's primary relief zone. I mean, we saw this quite devastatingly in 1971, didn't we? When expected support just evaporated during a critical conflict. And then later, you have the very punitive imposition of the Pressler Law. Now, this wasn't just about suspending future aid. It cut off existing military and economic assistance, even blocking delivery of equipment Pakistan had already paid for. It starkly showed that security based on external dependency is just fundamentally fragile.
A difficult history, no doubt.
Exactly. So this strategy proposes the only real alternative, leveraging the existing structure of what it terms friends near home. That's the contiguous ring, think China, Iran, Central Asia, and the Maritime Ring, which includes the Gulf states and Turkey. The key mechanism proposed is this deliberate low-profile economic integration. Now, what does that mean? It means pursuing economic cooperation and integration, like merging the ECO and the Gulf Cooperation Council, the GCC, to create this ECO, but doing so quietly without, loud military posturing or diplomatic declarations that would immediately provoke the West or India into containment strategies. Build the economic foundation first. That's the idea. And this foundation, crucially, is buttressed by China, a proven, time-tested partner, as we've seen with major projects like the KKH Highway and Gwadar Port. China provides that essential strategic link to both Central Asia and the Gulf, potentially offsetting India's regional influence.
Okay, I understand the argument for why this strategy is proposed, the necessity driven by past unreliability. But the proposed solution itself seems riddled with, well, structural weaknesses and maybe even contradictions. The alliance rings you described, they seem far too brittle to build a national security strategy upon. My first point really concerns the regional fragility. I mean, the stability of your entire contiguous ring pretty much hangs on achieving peace in Afghanistan. The source material itself calls Afghanistan the Achilles heel, and rightly so. Without some genuine, lasting stability there, forget about accessing the huge economic potential of the Central Asian states. That potential is the very fuel needed for this eco vision, isn't it? So the economic lifeline is basically cut before the eco can even gain traction. Secondly, we just can't wish away the existing power dynamics. The extra-regional forces, the ERF, primarily the U.S. and its allies, they are described in the text as being fully entrenched right across the Northwest Indian Ocean region. Their own strategic goals, like securing Gulf oil flows and protecting key allies, actively limit the maneuvering room needed for any truly independent regional security setup like the ECO aims to be. And finally, the strategy seems, perhaps, a bit blind to India's quite effective exterior maneuvers. India has successfully pursued rapprochement with countries Pakistan considers its friends near home, specifically key players in the Maritime Ring like Saudi Arabia and Iran. This directly undermines the structural integrity of the very vision we're discussing.
Well, I see why you highlight those geopolitical hurdles, but I'd argue they actually reinforce the strategic imperative for the eco rather than negate it. Let's focus on its feasibility for a moment. The idea of merging the eco and GCC, it's actually quite realistic because these states do share immediate converging interests, particularly around oil security and economic development. Yes, okay, the GCC currently might be seen as a weak and ceremonial alliance, often hampered by internal mistrust and maybe a lack of political will.
Right, that's a key weakness.
But the GCC states are also acutely aware of their naval vulnerabilities. They know they need to protect their sea lines of communication, their SLOCs, and their critical offshore oil infrastructure. The source material suggests that bringing in militarily capable regional nations like Iran and Pakistan offers the only practical way to transform that ceremonial GCC into a genuine, perhaps NATO-like regional security alliance. This integration could establish real deterrence against external aggression by providing the naval capacity the Gulf states currently lack. Isn't relying solely on the U.S. security umbrella the very definition of the external dependency this whole framework warns against? The shared threat perception in the Gulf, I believe, is a powerful enough driver for political convergence towards something like the eco.
That's a theoretically neat argument, but I think it fundamentally misreads the harsh political realities of the Gulf. I simply don't believe that shared threat perception is strong enough to overcome the massive political and frankly sectarian divides between core GCC members and, say, Iran or even Pakistan for that matter. The GCC remains weak precisely because the U.S. umbrella takes the immediate pressure off building genuine collective defense. And crucially, the U.S. isn't just standing by. The material states they are ruthlessly pursuing a policy of supporting certain regimes in the Gulf because, quote, they are easier to manipulate and control. Now, if the primary U.S. strategic aims are controlling Gulf oil and ensuring Israel's security, how could the formation of a strong, independent ECCO, which must include Iran and Pakistan to be effective, be seen as anything other than a threat to be, well, actively neutralized? The source even notes the potential for an India-Israel-Saudi Arabia nexus fostered by the U.S. specifically to guard Gulf oil. This isn't passive observation, it's active counter-maneuvering against the eco concept. We saw clear signs of this shift, didn't we? When key GCC figures like King Abdullah visiting India back in 2006 signaled that their strategic and economic future perhaps lies more with stable partners like India, not with Pakistan's ambitious yet politically volatile eco project.
While I acknowledge the geopolitical friction is intense, it just underscores the need for the second pillar of this vision, the absolutely critical shift to a maritime orientation. It's a fundamental security requirement to move away from what the book calls an obsolete continental mindset. And it's imperative because, look, 97% of Pakistan's trade relies on the sea. These SLOCs are the nation's economic lifeline. Any naval blockade by an adversary means immediate, potentially catastrophic economic strangulation. So the shift to a maritime orientation anchored by developing Gwadar Port, which is strategically positioned near the Straits of Hormuz, provides that vital strategic posture. It helps guard the Gulf entrance and shortens those critical SLOCs. This inherently boosts the security environment needed for the contiguous ring and the eco to actually function. Now, crucially, securing this strategy requires a credible deterrence capability, particularly a survivable second strike capability carried at sea. And that is why the ACCO's success is directly linked to providing the long-term financial stability needed to actually fund and sustain this essential maritime power.
Okay, but my challenge is with the feasibility of that very linkage. The effectiveness of this maritime shift hinges entirely on the Pakistan Navy, the combatant Navy, as the text calls it, achieving a very specific and frankly enormous minimal force level. The requirements laid out in the source are, well, highly ambitious. 12 destroyers or frigates, DDFF, and critically 3 nuclear submarines, SSNs or SSBNs. Let's be absolutely clear about the submarines. 3 nuclear boats is considered the minimum needed to maintain a continuous survivable patrol cycle, the kind required to guarantee a second strike deterrent at sea. Yet, the material itself points out that the Pakistan Navy has historically been, and I quote, a neglected service. Now, given that the chosen strategy is low-profile economic integration, which is inherently slow and gradual, designed specifically not to provoke immediate Western sanctions or alarm bells, how on earth can such a monumental, capital-intensive force goal, including acquiring or building nuclear submarines, possibly be achieved? We're talking about multi-billion-dollar strategic assets here. The proposed means slow economic integration just don't seem to align realistically with the ends, a rapid quantum leap in naval, particularly nuclear capability, within any practical timeframe, especially considering Pakistan's chronic internal financial constraints and the huge cost of sourcing advanced military tech from abroad.
I understand why you see a mismatch in pacing there, but let me offer a different angle on this internal challenge. The book itself seems to anticipate this exact problem. It explicitly states that achieving the eco and effectively leveraging these friends near home, it all requires putting Pakistan's own house in order first. Specifically, it points to the need for restoring genuine parliamentary democracy and achieving internal political cohesion. This democratic stability is mentioned repeatedly as the absolute precondition, the sine qua non, for securing full GCC membership and building the kind of long-term partnerships needed. The source even contrasts Pakistan's chronic instability with India's advantage, which it attributes to India's enduring democracy, allowing it to conduct consistent, credible, long-term diplomacy. So the strategy is viable, the argument goes, if, and it's a big if, that political foundation is secured first. The authors seem to insist that the political will and stability must precede the economic and military success.
That's it's a compelling point that shifts the burden entirely onto domestic reform. But haven't we seen this movie before? The ability to actually execute this political precondition seems highly doubtful, frankly. The material itself repeatedly highlights how Pakistan's policy decisions are so often driven by short-term contingencies rather than any consistent, long-term strategic vision. The historical pattern of military interventions is the core problem, isn't it? Military leaders, with General Pervez Musharraf cited as a key example, have repeatedly abrogated the constitution, used dictatorial rule, sometimes even playing the fundamentalist card, as the text notes, to justify staying in power illegitimately. This creates chronic internal political instability, which makes any kind of sincere, long-term diplomatic commitment, the kind needed for a deep, decades-long project like the ECO, practically impossible. The outside world, including potential key partners like Saudi Arabia or the UAE, they react to this lack of political credibility, this inconsistency. They naturally shift their focus towards more stable, economically reliable partners like India. The internal house historically has not been put in order. Relying on that prerequisite suddenly materializing feels more like a strategic hope than a concrete plan.
Well, this has been a thorough examination. It certainly confirms that the Friends Near Home framework tackles a truly critical strategic problem for Pakistan, stemming from, as we've discussed, an unreliable superpower relationship and a very ambitious regional adversary. And while the path of low-profile economic integration is undeniably difficult, slow, requiring immense resources and very complex diplomacy, I maintain it represents the only genuinely viable and necessary long-term course. It's the only strategy presented that leverages China's strategic weight and potentially unlocks the vast resources of Central Asia and the Gulf through the EECOC, ultimately building that sustained economic and military foundation capable of supporting the kind of deterrence we've talked about.
I agree, the strategic dilemma identified is absolutely acute. However, the sheer complexity of actually executing this vision, dealing with the active neutralization of these proposed alliances by India, the persistent and deeply entrenched U.S. strategic objectives in the Gulf that inherently oppose an independent ECO, And, perhaps most critically, Pakistan's own chronic internal political fragility and tendency towards reactive, short-term contingencies. All this suggests to me that this sophisticated strategic vision, however appealing on paper, will likely remain just that, a vision. A victim, perhaps, of the very geopolitical and internal forces it sought so ambitiously to circumvent. The preconditions for its success just seem too high, and the historical track record suggests they are unfortunately unlikely to be met.
Ultimately, though, I think we can converge on one point. The source material itself makes it abundantly clear, doesn't it, that achieving political stability and genuine democratic continuity isn't just some desirable domestic policy goal. It is the absolute core prerequisite for successfully pursuing any long-term strategic objective, whether that's economic integration like the ECOCOM RA or significant military modernization, especially when facing such complex regional dynamics.
Absolutely. I think that's the fundamental takeaway. The success of any grand strategy, no matter how cleverly designed, hinges entirely on the nation's ability to credibly commit to it over the long haul. And that means, as you said, the domestic house simply must be set in order before any ambitious international strategy can realistically hope to succeed.